Hello and welcome everyone to our event of Show Spectre Some Love just before Valentine's Day. This is a wonderful event that has been made possible by the hard work put in by people at Haymarket Press, at Pluto Press, and at Spectre. I particularly want to thank Chris Brown, Emily Orford at Pluto Press, and Ashley Smith at Spectre for putting this event together for us. My name is Tithi Bhattacharya. I am on the editorial board of Spectre, and it is my great pleasure and really exciting for me to be on this panel with people with whom I have worked um, on intellectual events, on political events, and just co-conspired with them over uh, wine and beer and various occasions. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Sarah Leonard, Susan Ferguson, and Erin Jaffe on this panel. I will be introducing each of the speakers before they're about to speak, but for now, let me just thank them um, for being on this panel to raise money for Spectre. So those of you who are tuning in can probably see the wonderful graphic for Spectre that has been put together by our artist Anne-Marie Nye. And we are using this moment as a fund drive for Spectre. I think what we have to understand at this moment of multiple crisis, particularly a financial one, is that journals that talk about anti-capitalism are in dire need of funding like other journals. But as an anti-capitalist journal, Spectre cannot be talking about blowing up pipelines while getting money from Shell Oil. So our journal is entirely a commoning project dependent on the generous donations from you and from the labor and generous time donated to the journal by our contributors and people who work on it. So we are launching a month-long events for fund drive for Spectre, which we hope that you will be able to donate to generously to keep anti-capitalist conversations bubbling, not just on our pages, but also on our streets through discussions and debate. So that is so much for why we are gathered today here. Let me tell you, for those of you who may not know, a little bit about Spectre. We see ourselves as coming together from various branches of Marxist theory and activism. But I think where we found common ground was in our belief that social oppressions are just as central to the anchoring of capitalism as is exploitation. In fact, on our editorial board and on our pages, one of the things we strive to do is try to understand the relationship between exploitation or the production of value, for those of you who speak in Marxist terms, and the multiple oppressions that scour that landscape of value making, but through race, gender, sexuality, ability, and other forms of dispossession. That is, we try to understand that relationship between exploitation and oppression um, in theoretical terms. We also try to center those movements and those activists who actually in their daily life contest, challenge, and fight against both of those forms of capitalist dispossession. So you will find in our pages, we try to talk as seriously about where the economy is headed, far more seriously than Paul Krugman can ever do, um, alongside of why the effort to defund the police is actually a central demand of our time. So we take both of these strands of anti-capitalist activism and thought as seriously as the other. In our world, there is no moment that takes priority over the other when it comes to class struggle. Race, gender, and other forms of oppression are how class struggle are expressed in our world. So this is a journal that actively needs your support, that actively needs for you to defend us and our worldview. And this is why we're really looking forward to working with you in these coming days and months. But in order to be able to do that in this world, we need financial support. We need your financial donations. So please, as we continue with this conversation, you will see a space for you to donate to Spectre. Please do so as generously as you are able. Now, it is my great pleasure to begin this conversation by talking to someone who is at the moment at the heart of launching a similar and related project of anti-capitalist conversation, but this time in a unique form of what they have once described to me as a socialist feminist glossy magazine. So the minute she said that to me, I thought, you know, I really want to recenter the original meaning of gossip, because gossip originally was women's knowledge, and it was the formation of capitalist networks of patriarchal knowledge that then made gossip a marginal form of knowledge which was secreted amongst women or was considered less serious. So when Sarah Leonard, one of the most critical feminist minds of our time, said she was going to start an anti-capitalist socialist feminist glossy magazine, I thought, I want to retrieve the meaning of gossip in its original sense of women's knowledge. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Leonard, a publisher for Lux magazine and one of its editors. Sarah is also a contributing editor to Dissent and to The Nation. So I start with Sarah. And my question for you, Sarah, is why Lux and why now?
Well, thank you for that fabulous introduction. It could not be more perfect. One of our writers actually once said to me, Liza Featherstone, who has a wonderful piece in here about Alexandra Kollontai, who wrote a great deal about love and comradeship, which I think we're going to discuss, said, every time you want to talk to me about something, you say, we need to gossip. She's like, I don't know if it's always gossip, but that's always what you call it. And I was like, yeah, because it sort of communicates, both that we have important information to share and that it's a pleasure to share it. So I fully embrace and welcome the historical meaning of gossip. And so to say a few words about Lux before we launch into our conversation, I just got my copy in the mail. Of course, if you subscribe now, you can get your copy in the mail. You can still get the first issue. It's very shiny. And it has Kanga Yamada-Taylor on the cover. We have a big profile of her sort of talking about what identity politics mean for socialists, which I know is something that Spectre is dealing with through a number of articles head on. And I should say all of us at Lux love to read Spectre and consider it a very important part of getting our brains moving in the right direction. And I should also say that if you get Lux, you can get with it the Quarant Zine, which is a zine that we made during quarantine because we're all obsessed with COVID, and for which Tithi wrote maybe the centerpiece article, a really beautiful piece about care and exploitation during the COVID crisis that really frames it in this powerful feminist way. And so with this magazine, a lot of us felt we had been longtime critics of sort of liberal or corporate feminism. You know, it, in a way, it's very easy at a certain point to criticize the feminism represented by Hillary Clinton, who, you know, supported welfare reforms and is, you know, supporting bombing other people. It's easy to make a criticism as to why that may not be a feminist position, and we did. Or why Sheryl Sandberg with Lean In, just encouraging women to work more, restricting her analysis, of course, to white collar women, was maybe not a helpful articulation of feminism. And we felt that we had sort of made those critiques. And once you've done that, and it seems like increasing numbers of people are open to them, it sort of behooves us to offer something better. And so this is our effort to say, okay, we see how popular definitions of feminism right now are very thin, very unsatisfying for many people. Come with us. Let's do something else. And so we're well aware all the time that we're drawing from a lot of really rich traditions. We're not inventing this wheel. But a lot of those traditions have not been passed down, in part because, you know, we live in a patriarchal capitalist society. The books are out of print, you know. I went looking for a lot of wages for housework documents and found they were poorly translated or not at all. So a lot of the legacy that is rightfully ours as socialist feminists has not been communicated to people or made available. And so part of our goal in doing this is to carry that down. And then, you know, we have a mix of reported pieces, first person narrative, foreign reporting. We have an article about radical sex ed. And the goal is really, you know, to create a door through which people can come to the left if gender is what they think about, or if they identify with the glossy magazine. I think a lot of us, especially people who grew up, you know, as teenage girls, read a lot of glossy magazines. That's kind of what there was. Like you would read 17 when you were 12, and you would read Cosmo when you were 17, and it's a very appealing format. It's very easy to read. It's very welcoming. And so for us, we wanted to make something that drew on those appealing factors that make it easy to come in that door, but fill it up with socialism. So it's not about compromising the seriousness of the work in any way, but it's about representing it in a way that is open to people who may not already be of the left. And so, as you can see, there's a lot of like full page photography, illustration. It's very beautiful inside. And to us, that was important because sometimes the left can feel inaccessible to someone who is unsatisfied with the status quo, but not familiar with the terrain. And so we wanted to be a little bit of a bridge and to fully embrace the socialist origins of identity politics as being about coming from a particular perspective, being clear about what that perspective allows you to see, and thinking of every bit of identity as a bridge to somebody else, rather than as a moat. And so that's a sort of rough overview of Lux. And we're hoping that, you know, much as many of our editors come out of organizing, a lot of the pieces in the magazine will feed back into organizing. And yeah, so that's sort of the gist. That's
Thanks so much, Sarah. That's amazing. So basically, you're trying to make the glossy into a subversive tool. That's essentially your project. And so, you know, I hope we can find Lux on in airport counters. You know, before mamas get on flights to go somewhere. I hope their teenage daughters grab Lux before just jumping on the flight. So
not
thank you for joining us. And those of you hearing in, please look out for Lux. Please subscribe to Lux. And I hope Lux brightens your day and the day of a girl in your life. So I am going to move right now to the next part of this event and to basically start the conversation. You know, all of us in some way or the other have been working on social reproduction and social reproduction theory. So what I wanted to start by talking about today was how can journals such as Lux and Spectre be a venue for a social reproduction research agenda? So, what can we do further? I mean, I think we are already moving in that direction, but this is a moment for us to kind of stop, reflect, and think what we could do further, or perhaps what we could do better. So, let me introduce our dear friends and Spectre editors, Spectre contributors, Susan Ferguson and Erin Jaffe. Susan Ferguson is an associate professor emerita, digital media and journalism. Sue's book, Women and Work, Feminism, Labor, and Social Reproduction, is a book from Pluto Press that you can perhaps see on screen right now. And it is an amazing book, which is a survey of precisely the category of labor through the history of capitalist unfolding. So it's a really vital book. I'm teaching it in my graduate seminar in the fall, and my students have had a preview and they just love it. So if you are teaching a graduate seminar on feminism or anti-capitalism or labor, this is the book to have. Sue, welcome to this panel. Our other speaker is also a dear friend, Erin Jaffe. And I want everyone to know how I first met Erin, not at a theoretical seminar, but in the organizing of the first international women's strike, where Erin was an active participant. Erin is an assistant professor of philosophy and liberal arts at the Juilliard School in New York. His articles have appeared in comparative literature, culture, philosophy, and social criticism, and other journals. He has written chapters in the Bloomsbury Companion to Marx and Critical Theories and the Budapest School. Erin's book, also part of the social reproduction series at Pluto Press, is an absolute must. It came out last year, and it was such a pleasure to edit this series for books such as such as Erin's. It's breaking up for me a little bit. His book is titled, as you can see, Social Reproduction Theory and the Socialist Horizon. And it is an amazing exploration of social reproduction as a theory and a political project. So without further ado, welcome Erin and Sue to this panel. I'm going to start us off with a question. So the way I think we want to do this is perhaps go in turns. So perhaps Sue, you can start it off, followed by Erin, and then Sarah take it back up. So let's start with Valentine's Day that's coming up. It's a day of romantic love. But revolutionaries, and particularly revolutionary feminists, have been challenging the bourgeois notion of romantic love since at least the 19th century, with, Marx and Engels come to mind immediately, but also Flora Tristan. The main thrust of this challenge has been that bourgeois love confines itself to the love between a romantic couple and cuts the couple off from the social whole, and in Kollontái's very evocative words, clips Eros's wings and maroons the couple on the desert island of the family unit. As activists and theorists who have struggled to resituate care and love as social phenomena, how do you think we can respond to this call to broaden or deepen love in the social sense for our times?
Okay, so Tithi, shall I
Yes.
come in now? I guess. Yes. Okay. So first, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this, and thank you to the co-panelists. I'm very honored to be on the panel with you folks today. I wanted to also point out that I don't think Sarah pointed out that Lux is named after Rosa Luxemburg, which I think is a very cute, smart thing to do too. But to get to the question, so I think social reproduction theory gives us a nice way of coming at the question of love and why love is so constrained on the one hand, and by that I mean so limited in its expression, or the tendency is so strongly pushed towards a particular type of love, that is the heterosexual form of love, and why love is also so difficult under capitalism. And I think it's difficult definitely for people who do not see themselves as, or are not comfortable with heterosexuality, but it's also difficult for people who are comfortable with heterosexuality. So, and I think we can start understanding that from a basic Marxist perspective to begin with, that capitalism relies on the self-sufficient, disciplined type of person. That's a type of person that needs to be produced for capitalism. An alienated person. Marx talked about how we are alienated from ourselves, which means that we tend to curtail and limit our needs and our desires, and redirect all our energies into working for a wage, which is ultimately working to produce, in the system of profit making. So the things that we're allowed to love under capitalism, we're allowed to love money, that's promoted, that's fine, and we're allowed to love things, but loving people becomes very, very hard in capitalism. But what social reproduction theory kind of brings to that discussion, I think, is to say, well, yes, that's a type of worker that gets produced, or that capitalism needs, but that worker themselves has to be produced, and produced in a particular way. And the work of producing that worker is both physical and emotional labor. And there's wonderful work throughout, I think, the tradition on precisely how care work is a real amalgam of often physical and emotional labor. Under capitalism, of course, it's required work because the workers do need to be produced, but it's also privatized, right? And it's shunted off into, for the most part, not solely, but for the most part, into private households and family formation. That's capitalism's kind of solution to love in some ways. And through all sorts of, and it supports and leads to all sorts of cultural and legal pressures toward sort of limited sexualities and family forms. So what I'm trying to say there, I guess, is that human relations are shaped in relation to that capitalist agenda for needing available certain types of workers, but they're not formed solely in response to that agenda of profit making, that it's not simply as simple as capitalism says we need X type of worker, therefore we need a family, therefore the family will produce this type of worker. Rather, what happens is you get this sort of tug of war, I think, between in people's lives, between the need to produce that self-sufficient, disciplined worker and the drive to meet, to really truly meet human needs and human desires, which are really expansive things. And ultimately, that contradiction in people's lives spells potential trouble for capital. And I think this is something we need to pay attention to on the left, because those needs and those desires don't, that get channeled in one direction. They, just because they're channeled in one direction and cut off, doesn't mean that they disappear. They're actually repressed, and they come out they spill out, I guess, in other ways, and that can be extremely painful for individuals who are spilling out as queer, or spilling, who have what are seen as kind of excess needs for access to what society, the sort of dominant social relations want out of people. But it is also, I think, potentially a basis for hope. And I'd be curious and looking forward to hearing what others have to say about that. I think it's a way, the fact that they exist, that those desires and excess of capitalist needs exist, and that are not necessarily oriented towards your heterosexual couple, single cisgendered couple, that I think that's an affirmation of how expansive human life and human desire can be, and how expansive our connections with other humans can be, and that are denied by and the fact that these are all denied by the way in which capital organizes our labor power, both our productive and our reproductive labor power, points us in the direction of what needs to be done, I think, in terms of trying to have more love, expanding and broadening and deepening love. And so I think it shows how as crucial to the left agenda, you need to support those struggles of people who are struggling to have spaces for that expansion of love. And that would be people who are in queer struggles, who are trying to develop supports for and different forms of family life, or if you want to call it that, and to look at other ways that are breaking down that kind of privatization of life making that capitalism keeps pushing us towards. So I'll stop there and have others add.
Thanks, Sue. Aaron?
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much for having me, Tithi. And I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation as well. Thank you for the generous introduction. So I was thinking about Valentine's Day and capitalism, and how social reproduction theory might have something to say in response to it. And I wanted to go back to kind of fundamental Marxist insight that in capitalism, we relate to people through commodities. And they bear the burden of mediating, even loving social relations through value expressed in monetary form that they are exchangeable for. And I think that that's a really fine early Marx insight that can help us see that the manner of mediation, the way that we socially relate, can in turn dominate us, not just facilitate our social relations or facilitate our social mediation. So the commodity and then the monetary form through which the commodity expresses its value are dominating forces in our lives. And it's not just enough to be aware that Valentine's Day is a capitally produced, reproduced hallmark holiday that is trying to engender all of our consumerist habits. We need to see that the love that it makes possible also sets a norm and sets a really guiding norm that are themselves constraining for like literally everyone, but especially those of us who love and desire in non-normie ways. And simply being aware of the fact that it's a consumerist-driven holiday doesn't do much to challenge it. So I fully agree with the setup in the question that we've got to broaden, we've really got to deepen our capacities for love. We've got to produce ourselves as loving subjects in a different kind of way. And that just can't be voluntaristically, you can't just decide all of a sudden, I'm going to love more freely. Kalante's got a wonderful essay about why that's just not possible. In order to love more freely, you need to fundamentally change the nature of social relations and probably get rid of private property at the basis of production in order to make love truly free. Otherwise, freer forms of love are just going to be accessible to those who are already comfortable, financially, capitalistically comfortable. And that's not going to be a true form of free love. So maybe unsurprisingly, I think the root of what social reproduction theory can offer in an attempt to broaden and deepen our love is a criticism of the very basis of capitalist social relations. That is the private property that determines, that gives the rise to commodities and the way they dominate our lives. So I think that social reproduction can show different possibilities of loving and of organizing production, organizing ourselves as loving beings by doing good historical work and showing that we didn't always organize ourselves through commodity mediation in the way that capital does, and point to future possibilities for doing that in the future. And perhaps most importantly, do the historical work of exploring the projects that did in some way begin to successfully challenge that mode of production, that root in private property, and look at the loving relations that emerged in different social contexts. I'm aware of good arguments about why sex is better under Yugoslav forms of socialist rule than capitalist ones. So that's just one instance. I think social reproduction theory is really well situated to do that research.
Thanks, Aaron. That's really helpful. So in a way, both of you are pointing towards that, not just a different definition of love, but also the more difficult project, I guess, that to approximate the love, we must challenge and reorder social relations as it stands as now. So that's more difficult, right? And Aaron, I'm very, it's a very important project that you outlined, that when you say it's not enough to be aware. So it's not enough not to buy flowers and chocolate for Sunday. You can refuse to buy flowers and chocolate for Sunday, but that does not actually take away from the fact that Sunday still is an overwhelming norm, that you are still kind of moving away from the norm, but you're not actually dismantling the norm. So that's a very, very important ride. Sarah, do you want to come in a bit here about love, as Kollontai calls it, a profoundly social emotion?
Yeah, it's such a hard thing about being a leftist that we can't just not buy the Valentine's Day card, and instead we have to rally a social movement to defeat capitalism. It is absolutely exhausting. But it's true. And I think it's certainly a thing that's true right now, that the less dense and comfortable a community we have, the more weight comes to rest on the couple. And you see that all the time. People have to move a lot. People's work is precarious. People can't afford to hang on to their apartment. I live in New York, so you basically move every few years to be able to still pay your rent. It's a mess. And left organizations, unions, the ways in which these important institutions were weakened for decades actually also reduces community around them. And so more and more comes to weigh on, this one person maybe who you have a romantic relationship with. And that, I think we can all agree, is not helpful. I've informed my close friends that I would be the aunt of their children, because we shouldn't reduce such things to the nuclear family. And the couple form, or the family, really becomes this sort of disciplinary mechanism that's so terrible. It's the opposite of love. There's this big emphasis in the culture that love or coupledom is natural. But if it were natural, we wouldn't need all these laws and tax codes and welfare requirements enforcing it. It's obviously not natural. There are many, many, many kinds of family. And so one of the things that we're trying to delve into in Lux is absolutely thinking about other ways of relating, love, but also comradeship outside the couple form. That's why we have a piece about Alexandra Kollontai, who is interesting because she's not just talking about, as everybody already said, individually coming up with a new way of relating. She was saying at the time, she's like, there are all these bourgeois women who think you can just go do free love and that's going to set you free. No, we need a material basis for this, which means free childcare, everybody gets free housing. There needs to be an infrastructure that supports a different sort of relationship. And of course, this was all bound up with sort of like pronatalism in all sorts of uncomfortable ways, and it certainly was not queer. So it's not some perfect roadmap. But the good point she makes is you actually have to build a material groundwork to be able to relate differently. And we have this one piece. It's an interview with Ariel at Thornhill, who's a writer creating a socialist sex ed book, and she is essentially bringing that argument up to the present. She says, you know, we talk a lot to kids, you know, be proud of your body, you know, like choose who you want to love, but we don't actually give them the infrastructure to make learning who you are and learning about sex low stakes. We don't have free testing. We don't have good sex education. We don't have easy access to healthcare. And we have a shocking homeless population. What do you need for pleasure? It really helps to have a roof over your head, so that you can make more choices. And so really, I think it's really a big socialist question, like what is the infrastructure we would want to build to allow the sorts of relationships that we want to have? What would apartment buildings look like? What would homes look like? What does love look like? And so we're trying to come at that from a number of different angles. We realized when we closed the issue that like a large number of our articles are about either good or bad sex. And I think, you know, part of it is we talk in this magazine about pleasure because it's actually a very ambitious horizon that we don't just survive, but we create the conditions under which love and pleasure can thrive.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. That's wonderful. So just to share with you, when I explained to my nearly 13-year-old what I was going to do this afternoon, she said, oh, for the capitalist, your program will be R-rated for sex and communism. And I said, yep, that's exactly right. Sex and communism, that's our ways to go ahead. So, you know, it's when you're talking about love in this particular way, I mean, the other thing that comes up as its double is heartbreak, right? And it's not surprising in a way. I've always thought about this, and I'm not sure if anyone has written about this, why it is that the leading socialist feminists or the leading female Marxists in socialist organizations, historically as well as in sort of anecdotally of those who we know, have had really difficult, intimate lives, right? So Luxemburg, Kollontai, just to name of those two that were named just in this conversation, but there are several, you know, CP members who are women who have had really difficult times. And as Sue says, not just, and that draws attention to the fact that under capitalism, it is not just queer relationships that are difficult, but also heterosexual relationships like Kollontai and Luxemburg may have had. So this brings me to maybe my second question, if we can do a go around, you know, thinking about heartbreak. What is, do you think, the relationship between loneliness and love under capitalism? And how can a politics of social reproduction mitigate, to a certain extent, the corrosive loneliness of capitalist social life?
It's a great question, and I'm so glad that we're opening up the discussion into these areas, which traditionally socialists haven't been that great about talking about, some have, of course, as you've pointed out, but you know, it's usually women feminists who have talked about it, but to think of them more as more integral to the socialist project is really, really important, I think, because precisely for the same reason that Sarah's magazine, the Lux, is trying to reach people who are not necessarily already open to socialism. I mean, these are the sorts of questions that will draw people in. So I think it's good that you've got all that about sex, all the sex questions in your first issue. It's probably a good start. But to loneliness. So the, you know, the key collective institution that we're allowed that's allowed to flourish to some limited degree in capitalism is the family, right? It's the, and it's, but again, as folks have already said, there's a, because it's a private institution, because it's a collective, but only in a very, very limited sense, a private institution, you know, it's collective in a limited sense, but it is essentially a private institution as well, where it is shouldering all the pressures of life making that we all know too well, that, you know, any kind of the human connections that exist in there are always going to be under some sort of strain because of the conditions of living under capitalism, and there's going to be a tendency to break them down, and because there, you know, the fact that there is a lack of other supports outside of there. So I think loneliness because of that is practically inevitable in capitalism. I think it's the state in which we are intended to live. And I think that, you know, not only, you know, there's also the case of the limited amount of collective interaction we're allowed to have, or that's promoted as in terms of actually really deep love for one another, is it comes under real stress, because there's a real premium on maintaining that family connection, so that if that's your only space where you can love, it puts a lot of stress on the people, on the lovers in that space, to be lovable always, right? And to maintain that their place in that family. And so I think, you know, one of the things that social reproduction theorists have to think, or feminists have to think through, is how do you support alternatives for people, spaces and places where there's an openness and you know, where they can create loving interactions in different ways. So I think that's certainly one thing that we should definitely be thinking about and doing. But I also think, I guess the other point I would make is that love, you know, there's romantic love, but but I think Sarah made a reference to comradeship, and the idea of love as being this somewhat more amorphous, comes in different styles and sizes and shapes, is really, really important. And I think that if you think of it on a continuum of friendship, you know, to deeply romantic love, or whatever you want to, and just sex, or whatever, but this is all kind of on a continuum. And I think one of the places where you can really develop different forms of human interaction is in struggle with other people. And I think that that's one of the things that we really do need to kind of also talk about. And I think you see kind of new forms of interaction with people when people go on strike all the time. You know, they care for each other. You think of the Chicago teachers' strikes as sort of a really classic example of, you know, teachers treating their students as more than just learning vessels, or, you know, vessels for knowledge, but as real people who they then care about, they go and deliver food to. Those are, you know, that's an act of love. Disaster relief is also, you see it all the time. And in fact, just to mention Pluto's a third book by that's come out in our series, which is Pierre Illner's book on disasters and capitalism. What's it called? You'll correct me, but I think it's Disasters and Social Reproduction. So Pierre's book is all about, how people have organized from below in, I don't think he uses the term, but in loving ways, really, and how that social reproducing their lives from below and taking control actually produces some issues, but it also produces new ways of finding collective support, I guess, and friendship. I would say the same for, Black Lives Matters protests in the streets, Occupy, Tahrir Square. You see those forms of connections happening. So I think that in those small ways you have the potential always, and it's never unproblematic, but there's potential always for life expanding relations between people that revalue life and love in different ways. So.
Thanks so much, Sue. Aaron, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with everything Sue said, but maybe I'll just try to add on a little bit. I think that loneliness under capital is corrosive. And I like the phrase that I saw it in the question earlier. I think it's a corrosive form of loneliness. It isn't just that under capital we lack capacities for our loving to be realized, our possibilities for loving to be realized or actualized. It's, I think, more like loneliness digs really deep and shapes, maybe even contorts what love can look like. Sometimes it even sets the limits on what we can imagine as the shape of love, or our capacities for it going forward. I think that really narrows our horizons. I think capital is a conservatizing force in our lives, constantly needing to reproduce social relations, reproduce our labor power so that we can go back to work again the next day, so that we can pay rent or meet our mortgage payments, so that they can pay back our student loan debts. It's not a good way of broadening our capacities for relating to each other, or more robustly developing capacities for love. So I think capital indeed produces us as lonely, and then identifying with our individual labor power that we have to sell, we have to trade at best for a wage to reproduce ourselves in a competitive labor market is deeply isolating. And then looking for fulfillment of that isolation and contortion through another, which is often similarly situated, is really a recipe for disaster. I think often it's a recipe for reciprocal and at best compatible lonelinesses in couple form. And that's deeply disappointing. So that relationship setup receives a limited form of reprieve in the outlet of, again, the workplace. Like, you go to work, at least that's a form of socially relating to another that isn't deeply overburdening or disappointing. And then work is a form of relieving the kinds of corrosive loneliness produced under capital. And of course, that's ideal. That's ideal for the capitalist and for the boss. So you don't even have to love your work to find it as a mode of social interaction that provides a release from, right, the kind of overly normative or overburdened attempts at love in couple form. And I think COVID-19 is really showing how overburdened our loving relationships are when so many of us cannot leave to go to work. Having to stay home is really, really creating problems for lots of different kinds of couples and setups. Now, I think, as Sue really emphasized, the politics of social reproduction is a nice way to begin pushing back against that. The politics of social reproduction, not the theory, I'm going to drop my philosopher hat for a second, but the politics of social reproduction, really struggling for better forms of social integration, really struggling for better social relations, binds people together. And that's never lonely. That can never be a lonely process. Working together with comrades is really powerful, sometimes even loving. And I'm not embarrassed to say it, sometimes it's also charged erotically. So I think more powerful love can indeed come from the struggle that is the politics of the social reproduction.
Thanks, Aaron. So speaking of sex and social movements, one of the most powerful interviews I remember was interviews of folks who had participated in the 1980s miners' strike in Britain. And they went back and interviewed those who were active in the strike, And one was, at the time of the interview, this woman was an elder. She was, in her late 60s, early 70s. And the interviewer said, well, what is the most memorable part of the strike for you? And she said, sex with my husband, because we rediscovered each other. And it was just such a wonderful moment for me to hear that, this near 70-year-old saying that. It was just fantastic. So it speaks to the point that you just raised. Sarah, I want to maybe ask you to tell us a little bit about the fact that what Sue and Aaron outlined, the burden upon the romantic couple, right? That capitalism puts, that all your love must be tailored in this little narrow horizon, and that's what love is. But in actual practice, however, even under capitalism, none of us are loved or love in those narrow horizons, right? So your childhood, for instance, or at least mine, is filled with liminal figures like the aunt, the uncle, who are not related by blood, but who gave you, the forbidden book that your parents didn't allow you to buy, who gave you, your first trip to a cinema that your parents thought you shouldn't be watching, so our lives, and my life, was very, very enriched by my grandparents, with whom I was very close. So we're not really talking about so much the absence of loving figures. We are talking about the invisibilization of those kinds of loves and the prioritization of certain kinds of love over other. So, in other words, it's an even more, I would say, sort of disgusting situation where these loves do exist, but are not given the grounds to deepen and embed themselves or to enrich lives in the way that they should. So I wonder what you think about that, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. I was also very close to my grandparents, and they made a huge impact on me. And it's certainly true that any child does better with many adults in their life, not just two. And this emphasis on the parents having some sort of very important ultimate authority over the child that cannot be challenged by anybody else is a little piece of fascism. It's not helpful. And, there's this big, heavy emphasis on the family form, because every time the state doesn't want to pay for something, well, it's the family's responsibility. If families would be more responsible, crime would go down, poverty would end. I mean, it's amazing what apparently would happen. And so it's useful to posit the sort of moral nuclear family as this important institution and source of authority. But like you say, that's not a functional model for practically anybody. I think it's among other things very, very isolating. And in terms of loneliness, I mean, the family under this particular ideology is sort of the route into sociability. So if you look at the American suburbs, it's only families. God forbid you be there and not be part of a family in a, individual house with an individual lawn. And the difference between that and thinking about New York back in the day had some quasi-socialist co-op buildings, and that was actually a space of democracy. The home was a space of democracy. People were collectively making decisions about the building. There was collective cooking going on, childcare. I think there was a building where they were required to have a youth representative. So like a kid would be like running for office. And the difference between that and the sort of extreme separation of a place like the suburbs, where everything is hidden and separate, is so extreme. And that hidden, separate, individualized model is so bad for everybody. And, I think Aaron was making this point too, that it's sort of, one of the things that's corrosive about it is that under capitalism, especially lately, risk is very individualized. So everyone in the suburbs like has a mortgage and like has debt they're embarrassed about. I mean, we all have debt. Whereas in a more collective space, there's a lot of shared responsibility. And so the loneliness comes from like, you know, having this stuff you're also ashamed about or anxious about, like carrying a lot of burden, a lot of risk, a lot of anxiety, and only you can deal with it. You know, there's no help, there's no solidarity, and there's no community. And that's so brutal. You know, that's not a way that anybody should have to live. And I think loneliness practically always comes with a sense of shame, because it's a feeling of being outside of the community somehow. You must have done something wrong. And so I think there's nothing worse than shame. That shame doesn't make you want to organize. It doesn't make you want to be out in the world. It makes you feel like you have to stay separate. And I think that's just the worst thing that can happen mentally to a human being. It was very, very powerful during Occupy when everybody started talking about their debt, because that was what everyone was ashamed of. And then everyone was like, oh, we all have it. Okay, well, this is a useful step forward. I feel less horrible and more like I can organize with other people. I mean, that's when the Debt Collective started, which was an idea partly from the great Astra Taylor. And so I think putting all this emphasis on the individual and the individual family, of course, inevitably is going to make us very lonely. And I think with Rosa Luxemburg or any of her comrades, I mean, on the one hand, I'm tempted to say, well, anybody who dates, maybe especially men, you know, it's not going to go great most of the time. You know, I'm actually reading Rosa Luxemburg's letters right now, and there are all these letters to Leo that are like, you write to me about the magazine, but what are your feelings? It's like, oh God, nothing changes. But you know, of course it's harder in a situation where it's going to be harder for someone who is not conforming to social norms. You know, something like the institution of the family gives you an entry into society in a way that is accepted, and there are prescribed ways to be social, and that makes it a little easier. But it doesn't make it satisfying.
Exactly. And, you know, obviously, we all know so much about Leo Joyce's work, and Rosa Luxemburg is just a footnote to history. So, so I read those letters and my blood just boils, right? Like the way he treats her, the way he ignores her. And it's like, who the hell are you? And, but it's really important that you bring the question of shame together with another profoundly capitalist emotion, right? The shame, because these are all, I wonder if we can think about sort of mobilizing affects and demobilizing affects, you know, sort of shame and loneliness as demobilizing affects under capitalism, whereas anger can go both ways, right? Anger can be a mobilizing affect as well. So, so this is really wonderful. So I want to already there are several questions from our audience to all of you speakers. So I want to give you a chance to answer them, but I have. But while we do that, I want you to think about some final thoughts, and we'll come back to those, about how you think Spectre as a journal can further a social reproduction agenda. So I want to leave that for the last bit, but right now I want to get to the questions because there are so many of them right now. So do you want to reverse the order of speakers and how we go forward? So Sarah gets a pass at them first, and then ending with Sue, but also feel free to say pass on some of these questions, because there is 3 of you, so we can share it as a collective task of trying to answer them. Okay, so here's the first one. It is impossible to think about Valentine's Day this year without thinking about the pandemic and global recession, which which many have called a she-cession. How have these catastrophes impacted class, gender, and sexuality from a social reproduction perspective?
Yeah, so I feel like in answering this, I just want to sort of regurgitate your essay, Tithi, from the zine, and which you've also written elsewhere. I'm going to do an inferior version of it, but I do think, actually in Tithi's phrasing, what the recession and the handling of COVID has shown is that capitalism is happy to extract. It's a project of death against a project of life, which is care work and the reproduction of society. I mean, COVID has been so interesting because it's a scenario wherein clearly capitalist institutions, especially ones that, for example, run our healthcare system, have clearly sucked so much out of the system that we have basic infrastructure that doesn't work anymore, and people are dying as a result. People are also being radicalized as a result. And it seems like we're at this point where capitalism is sort of eating the ground out from under itself. One of the important things to remember is that the people who have been telling us for years that we needed, for example, safe staffing ratios in hospitals are nurses, mostly women, and that they have been incredible organizers, including for Medicare for All, but also at individual hospitals, telling us for years and years and years, we don't have the resources we need to take care of people, to keep people alive. And if we had been listening all along to nurses, if they had not faced such staunch opposition from hospitals and from investors in the healthcare system, fewer people would be dead. This is really a case where it's not only a question of fighting alienation by giving people more control over their work, but it's a matter of life or death. I mean, the people who deeply understand this work, had they been in charge of it, more lives would have been saved. And of course, this mentions a sort of she-cession, which is true. I mean, women still work for lower wages. So in a two-income household, it's going to tend to be the woman who leaves waged work. And childcare in this country is totally dysfunctional and wildly expensive. And so someone has to stay home and take care of the kids. And it's just a perfect disaster in terms of women's wages, employment, and also of the incredible pressure on care work. And I think some people thought that maybe now that so many people had to work from home, typically white collar workers, that among those workers, some of the men would take over half the care work finally. And that did not happen. That they have now measured that. It did not happen. So we're still in a case where all of the unpaid labor of reproducing society is landing with women, and it just got 1,000 times harder.
Thanks, Zara. Aaron?
Just really quickly, I guess. I'm not sure how much I have to add. That analysis sounds like exactly right to me. But maybe just in a hopeful vein, I think that the shape of class politics is going to be obvious and even more deeply gendered going forward as a result of this recession than we've already seen, and just demonstrated to be the case. I think Sarah's absolutely right to point to nurses, disproportionately women, at the forefront of the labor struggle. We could also talk about the teacher strike waves of the last couple of years, where obviously disproportionately women. And with a recession that has hit women so much harder than men, we're going to see a radicalization around gendered forms of labor, and then I think in women in general. And I think that those of us who pretend to Marxism through just a gender blind analysis of the proletariat are in for a really rude awakening, right? The class struggle is and will be even more gendered going forward, directly as a result of the social processes that the questioner has identified.
Thanks, Erin.
Yeah, I can't add a whole lot more to that. Those are, I totally agree. And I guess, you know, one of the things that it did, that the COVID has proven to us is just how differentiated classes are by racialized people, by gender, by sexualities. And one of the big things that really stood out for me too is the ways in which the home orders were so completely negligent around questions around violence in the household, and that's violence against women, but violence against queer people, queer children in particular. You think about the closing of schools and what, you know, which could be a place in which queer kids, in fact, is a place where queer kids can sometimes, even though school can be terrifying for them too, but it's also sometimes has resources for them. They lose those. I mean, it's just, so I think it really has shown how very differentiated the working class is, and how I hope you're right, Erin, that it's a moment for hope that it will create some fighting spirit too.
Thanks, Sue. So the next question, I'm going to let Sue get first pass at, because I'm not sure who asked this question, but I want them to know that Sue's book essentially deals with this topic. So I really encourage you to also look at Sue's book. So the question is, I am curious when the nuclear family became so important historically.
So the first thing to say is that it's been important historically, primarily in Anglo-Euro world, first and foremost, I mean, the early bourgeois nuclear families were sort of starting to form quite a while ago, but I think the key question is, when did the working class become, you know, more organized through the nuclear family? And I think that has to go back to the 19th century protective labor legislation that gets introduced in Britain, where capitalism was the most developed, and then subsequently elsewhere. It was pushing women out of the workforce, came along with a slight rise in men's wages, so that there was some ability to afford that. So I think mid 19th century is where that starts in England, and it kind of develops and consolidates. But even by you know, the 1920s, it's still never universal, and it's never, but there's still debates and discussions about, you know, what you know, nuclear families should look like, and should women be in and out of the workforce? I mean, so it's fully a nuclear family. That model is really something that we base that theorists kind of universalized from the post-war North American largely experience of increased wealth when it got a little bit more consolidated. But I think so. I hope that answers that question a bit.
Thanks, Sue. I mean, this really is, Sue, your answer really leads to also Erin's own work, that it's not that there ever existed a nuclear family per se, didn't exist in that sense, especially for Black women in the United States, for migrant families and so on. But what Erin tries to hone our attention on is the norm of the nuclear family, right? So that became a historical truth at some point, as you point out, that's not so much that it existed in practice, but it did exist as a disciplinary norm for all other forms of social life to get organized. Am I kind of paraphrasing you okay there, Erin?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that norm exists as a kind of general, it's like in the air culturally, but it also exists through like state repression and job place repression. Ford sociologists went into the homes of people to make sure that they were like living in the right way in order to continue working or to be, considered for promotion. And I think that there's significant, even social reproductive work that's been done on showing how the state intervenes in, non-normie types of families in order to make them appear accordance with its norms or to be deserving of welfare. And I think that work ought to continue to be done, and we ought to continue to challenge that sort of general cultural zeitgeist through our living practices, through a refusal of shame, as Sarah really insightfully recognizes, but also at the level of like actual job place struggle and against state authority and incursion into our more freely chosen family forms.
Thanks, Aaron. So Sarah, you mentioned Yugoslavia. So this is a question made for you. I am curious, asks the person, about speakers' thoughts or critiques of Kristen Godsey's Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism.
Well, I don't know if I have like a useful critique of the book itself. I think, it's a really interesting argument. I think one that's important for socialists, which is that you can't just imagine your way to better relations. You have to create the conditions for them. And that's been done in many socialist states to varying degrees of success. There have been some criticisms of the book for not dealing with some of the failings of those states, in that they tended to emphasize reproduction. They were not necessarily about supporting queer relationships. They were trying, in many cases, to increase the population, which is a classic goal of states to control. That is what a state often is doing, is trying to control the population, often in terms of its size. And in the US, you look at it through the essentially eugenic policies of the state. Different states have different goals for its population. Anyway, I think, I don't want to sort of idealize those states for this reason. But the broader idea that we have to create infrastructure for the sorts of relations we want, I think is true. And it's always this difficult question for socialists, what is our relation to the family? What kind of families do we want? And I think the answer that many of us come to is like, well, we just don't believe in defining that. The goal is to take the family out of the calculus for social welfare so that you're going to be okay no matter what. You don't have to get into a family to be okay. And then from there, we don't really know what families will look like, and that's fine. One of the sort of most sort of bizarre disciplinary mechanisms mentioned in Melinda Cooper's book, Family Values, which is fantastic. The mechanism is not fantastic. It's a story about Reagan's welfare reform in California. And so he's trying to beat down the welfare rights movement, which is led by Black women, and reinforce what he thinks of as a sort of family norm, because he wants to cut welfare. He wants families to be responsible for their own welfare. And so at the same time as he's trying to cut welfare, he invests in tracking down deadbeat dads, because they need to come back and provide for their families, not the state. And a lot of these guys have no money, for one thing. And for another, the woman doesn't necessarily want to be with him. This is like forcing people into having some kind of relationship so the state doesn't have to pay for something in the most explicit terms. So yeah, this idea that we get from explorations of socialist states that actually the reproduction of human life is all of our business and should be socialized rather than relegated to the family is a very, very good one.
So I have another question that I think many of you touched upon, but I'll ask it anyway, is one of the amazing things about the global wave of uprisings, they write, from BLM in the US to the second wave of the Arab Spring to the uprisings in Hong Kong and Thailand, and of course to the wave of feminist strikes, has been the leading role women have played. Why is that the case? Anybody? Sue, you want to?
Sure, I can start, but you know, and I'll just say I think that women have been socialized to be carers and to be looking after the sorts of things that a lot of these protests have been centered on, and so I think it makes some sense. They're in the right space at the right time in some ways, and but I think it's more complicated than that, because of course they've been like that forever. So why now is maybe a better question, or a good question to ask too. And I think that, I mean, why now for anything? I guess it's a little bit hard to tell, but I do think that the roles that there is a bit of a domino effect in terms of these uprisings, part of which, one very important part of which has been the International Women's Strike and its organization from 2015, starting in Poland, or 16. I'm one or the other, Poland and Spain and Italy, various iterations, and then here in the US, and how it's spread. But I mean, I think what happens is that there's a certain re-legitimization of feminist struggle, I think, with that that has that is global, and I think that that's crucial to the ongoingness of women continuing to take to the streets and organize and lead in different aspects, really, fights that are centered around trying to take greater control over the conditions of our social reproduction, and which they are the experts in, quite honestly.
Something that I thought was interesting this summer was, we talk a lot in social reproduction, like Sue just said, about how women are doing all this work that allows capitalism to continue, and are therefore the shock absorbers of neoliberalism. So, childcare, elder care gets cut. Who's going to do it? Well, usually women. And all the movements, if you look during the uprising this summer, defund the police. It's like, okay, we want to take money from the police. We want to put it in healthcare, mental health care, housing, good transportation, childcare. If you look at the reproductive justice movement, it's like, okay, we don't just want money to fund abortion. We want money for education, housing, childcare, transportation, all the same stuff, right? Like, all of these movements that are led by women tend to have this very holistic view of what we're trying to get and what we need, because I think disproportionately women are enmeshed in solving those problems every day, like you said. And so I think that is why, as Erin alluded to earlier, women, especially women of color, have been at the forefront of all of the most exciting uprisings in both labor and social activism over the last several years, whether that's defund or the teacher strikes.
Can I just add that also, sorry, Erin, just really quickly, there's a historic precedent for that too, in terms of bread riots and that sort of thing too. We're often led by women, right?
And the two major revolutions of the 20th of the modern era, the Russian and the French, were started by bread riots by women. So there we go. We rest our case. Erin, go ahead.
I'd only add that, like, in addition to, I think Sue and Sarah really nicely spelled out, like, women are like disproportionately charged with dealing with the harder consequences of rising costs or declining wages or increasing state repression or declining state support or all of that. But in addition, women are disproportionately charged with the responsibility to provide social support and integration. for family members, disproportionately charged with socializing within families, but also between families, as women have broader social connections in general than a lot of men. And so women, I just think, are just way more, not naturally, but socially and historically produced, way more naturally fit to be excellent political organizers. Like just because of the ways that their labor is produced and expected to be done continuously, women are just in the positions to be to do the work of building movements and being at the forefront of them. So I think there's good political economic reasons for why around the world we see women really at the forefront of so many rising movements.
So essentially you're saying, Aaron, that because we are always the ones who think about and are tasked with writing the Christmas cards in order to keep up the family networks, that's the same kind of skill that you need to keep up connections between various community insurrections. Fantastic. Okay, I'm never going to complain about writing Christmas cards again. Okay, thank you. This has been such a marvelous chat with all of you. And we're getting to the end of our time. So I want to sort of direct everyone's listening in attention to the sort of donation page for Spectre. And I want to end by, I guess, giving all three of you a moment to think about or talk about how, as a journal, Spectre can relate to Lux, but also how, as a journal, Spectre can advance this project of thinking about social reproduction in this really, really expansive and communitarian ways that you have outlined. What can our journal do to kind of push that agenda?
Some of the things that I've loved reading on Spectre's site have actually been dispatches from people working in different fields, especially during COVID, that often relate to social reproduction. And I think there's very little good work like that being done elsewhere. The New Left Review decades ago used to have this series of worker diaries from different fields, both blue and white collar, that were quite remarkable and really gave you the flavor for many different types of work and the very specific forms of tedium or physical feeling produced in different sorts of labor that I actually thought was sort of remarkable, and I've loved reading this stuff on Spectre. And I'm definitely interested in the concept of family abolition, which is an interesting term because I think it potentially runs at, or sounds like it's running at odds with concepts of reproductive justice, which are sort of about the right. The term abolition is very particular in the US, obviously. It starts with slavery and moves through talking about the police. And so this concept of family abolition, which I think is very useful, is also like, I don't know, in an interesting framework to like sort of explore and unpack and work with. And I think something I've been very curious about and I feel is under theorized, and Spectre does so much brilliant work and sort of in this space, is in thinking about childcare and why childcare has not become a major issue in the United States recently, when in fact it's a massive problem for so many people. Is this a question of essentially sexism in politics, that it's not considered a major issue? Is this about decades of ideological reinforcement that like it has to be about the family? Like, is this because women are like an incredibly poorly organized constituency? Like, what is going on here? It's a massive problem for practically everybody in different ways, and an unorganized sector completely. Is that part of why? I don't know. I feel like there's a thing here that is like, could use some real attention. But I will say, as just an outsider, something I love about Spectre is that it is producing this theoretical work that is in dialogue with what's happening on the ground. It really, it advances theory while feeling like it is of the movement. And so I suppose, you know, I feel silly saying, well, Spectre could do this or that, because clearly it's already being edited in this direction that, as someone outside the magazine, I find incredibly valuable. And I think the goal of both of our magazines in certain ways is to build a community around it, use the magazine to connect, you know, intellectuals and people doing organizing work and people on all bits of the left to have a space to sort of synthesize their ideas. And I think Spectre does that so beautifully. So I'm humbly looking forward to more.
Thank you, Sarah. What a generous comment. Thank you so much. Aaron, do you want to?
Sure. I fully agree with Sarah. I've also thought about the relationship between social reproduction and abolition. Right? Abolition can be understood in at least two senses. One is like radical cessation, like it's done and it's over and it is no more. And the other is a kind of Hegelian, I guess, notion of abolition, where you transcend and preserve by multiplying instead of it just being absolutely negated. It's realized in different or higher or so many plural different forms. And I think putting the politics of abolition, especially around race and family form, in relation to social reproduction is going to be really fruitful going forward. Getting clear about that and getting clear about how that could guide struggles in different ways, or different notions implicitly are already guiding struggles in different ways, would be super exciting. But one of the things I super love already about Spectre is that it's giving a place for people to see what's going on, not just in the US, but the US understood as a part of the broader international world, and also having reports that aren't US focused. It's giving an international perspective to struggle and helping people politicize in a way that feels more radical, more hopeful, and less beholden to I guess I'll just say the existing ecosystem of left journals.
Thanks so much, Aaron. You can read a review of Aaron's book in Spectre in the second issue, and we hope that to continue these conversations. That's a really, really useful pointer, Aaron, about talking through abolition, the category of abolition for future Spectre pieces. Sue.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to this because I totally agree. I was going to start by saying what a great job Spectre already does do. And just for folks who may not know, in the first two issues of the journal, there are book reviews of my book, of Aaron's book, of Sophie Lewis's book, Full Surrogacy Now. There's a nice piece on social reproduction, its relationship to immigration by Ashley Borer. So there's a lot there. And then on the website, as has been, you know, there's lots of coverage about the COVID and social reproduction. There's some really interesting stuff. And this is the one thing that I think has got to be an ongoing challenge for us is I'm thinking things along the lines of what Kate Doyle-Griffiths has done on thinking through the relationship between movement building and trade unionism or the union movement, the labor movement more generally. So I think that's very important strategically for socialists working on the ground, and to do that from a social reproductive perspective. I think there's so many areas that you could explore. I liked what Aaron said earlier, even, you know, doing the historical work at looking at alternative communities, when and how other communities of care have developed. I think questions around debt and social reproduction are, you know, going to become increasingly important too. So I mean, you know, and ongoing, you know, what I think, again, because socialists are sometimes not very good about talking about interpersonal violence. I think that that's also an area that social reproduction theory can you know, delve into and maybe usefully too. But I mean, I'm sure there's more. And but I do think you're already doing a really fabulous job. So I really, really would encourage people to click on the donate button and to try to keep both, you know, the website and, you know, it's the journal, the hard copy journal that's the most expensive thing to keep going, and it would be a shame to lose that, I think, too. So
Thank you, Sue. So I know I speak for all the editors on Spectre when I say that I, in turn, have an ask of you to continue to contribute to the journal and to guide it with your thought and your activism on the ground. So for those of you listening in, thank you very much. Please continue to read, subscribe to Spectre and to Lux. And please do click on that donate button for Spectre, because remember, neither Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk is going to do that for us. So we need you to click on donate. And for this coming weekend and for the rest of the year, we wish you profound, social, dirty, and insurrectionary love. Thank you.